Hi there, this is Pastor Dan from Calvary Chapel, Cle Elum, Washington. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 24 to 27, we find that fascinating story of Jesus walking on the water to come to his disciples while they're in the midst of a terrible storm on the Sea of Galilee, a storm that is threatening their lives. The story illustrates that there are times in our lives when we can be walking with the Lord, doing all that we think He desires of us, and still things go south in a big way. And when this happens, sometimes our fear can derail us. We see this with the fear of the disciples in this story. They had obeyed Jesus by getting in the boat and heading to the other side of the sea. But then they found themselves in this terrible storm in the middle of the night, and it looked like they were about to die. And while this was happening, they likely had at least two fears, maybe more. Let's look at the disciples' first fear. We pick up the story in Matthew 14:24. It says, "But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary." So this huge storm had come up while they were out in the middle of the sea, and the wind was blowing in the opposite direction that they wanted it to be blowing in. So they had to row the boat in order to move in the direction that they needed to go. But they were apparently not making much progress, and the storm was really, really bad. This gives you a mental picture of what these 12 men were going through. How would you feel if you were in their situation? You might have already been perplexed that Jesus sent you away when things seemed to have been going so well that day. Not only is it very late at night and you're exhausted, but you find yourself rowing very hard and not making much progress. You're wet and cold, and it seemed like a long time that you ate your last meal, that meal of bread and fish. Safety is a huge issue because you also know that these storms can be very, very dangerous. The waves are crashing against your boat, making it creak and groan with the strain as you row for your life. You think it would be different if Jesus were present because He had calmed the storm and He had calmed the wind and the waters and so forth the last time that you had been in a storm like this. But He's not there. There is a huge element to fear because you know you could capsize and drown. So that's their first fear, and it's a substantial one. That brings us to the disciples' second fear. It's near Passover, so the moon would have been nearly full, and it would have illuminated the surrounding hills and the white caps of the waves. And then they saw something they could never have expected. Matthew 14:25 to 26 says, "Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out for fear." Now, it would have been frightening enough just being in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in the midst of this storm. But now they see something that they simply cannot comprehend. The Greek word means that they were shaken, upset, thrown into confusion and alarm. The men saw something that was beyond their ability to understand. They never expected Jesus to meet them in the middle of the Sea of Galilee in any case, by any means, and even more so in the middle of such a windstorm. What would you think, and how would you react if you had been in their situation? Put yourself in their position. Wouldn't you be afraid? Well, of course you would, regardless of how much you might think that you wouldn't. The hair on the back of your neck would be standing straight out. The adrenaline would be pumping, and your heart would be pounding, just like theirs did. No wonder they cried out for fear. Now listen, the circumstances of this situation are particular to the disciples, but all of us will face similar scenarios in life. Just when you think things are starting to go pretty well, God does something that you don't understand. Most people do fine as long as everything is going well, but when troubles and trials start and things happen which are not understood, then faith is tested and often found not to be as large as previously thought. Your car, before you can get it fixed, the roof starts leaking. Then the furnace gives up and you get a notice from a collection agency for a bill you were sure you paid. Or perhaps it's more serious. Your job is threatened, or you lose it, and in the middle of that, there's a health crisis, or a friend rejects you, or a loved one dies. The storms of life have been bad enough as you've been rowing as hard as you can to reach the shore, but now you are facing something that you don't even understand. In fear and frustration, you start questioning if God knows what He's doing and wondering why He's abandoned you. How does God respond to us, and how should we respond to God at those times? Listen, we may not be able to handle our fears, but God can. And so the disciples cry out in fear. My guess is they were actually crying out to the only one who could possibly help them, God. And what happens immediately after they cry out to God? Jesus speaks to them in the midst of their fear. Matthew 14:27 says, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid.'" That is so comforting, folks. Jesus knew what they were going through. Mark 6:47-48 says, "Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and He was alone on the land. Then He saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them." And what was Jesus doing at the time? Well, Mark tells us He was praying. And my guess is He was praying for them. They may have felt alone and abandoned, but Jesus had His eye on them. The same is true for us, I believe. Certainly they did, and we do, face frightening situations. But knowing that Jesus has His eye on us should bring reassurance and peace. But Jesus not only watched and prayed, He went to be with the disciples. And when they cried out in fear, it caused Him to identify Himself and calm their fears. "Be of good cheer," He said. "It is I, do not be afraid." And when He said, "It is I," He was using the divine name given to Moses in Exodus 3. "I am that I am." And He was applying it to Himself. This was no ghost, but it was Christ the Creator, soon to be their Savior, walking on the water. It was the sovereign Lord who rules over the details of His creation among them. So He could say, "Cheer up, I am. I am not a ghost or a figment of your fearful imagination. I am Creator. I am the one that comforts. I am faithful, and I am with you. Do not be afraid." Jesus' promise to the apostles in Matthew 28 is still true for us. He is still with those that have placed their faith in Him and have believed in His name. And He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. Many of you know the same experience of the disciples. You have faced the fear of disease or bad news or death's door or an accident or some other situation. Right in the midst of fear, you have looked to the Lord. You've thought of His promises and recognized His presence, and suddenly the fear is gone. The situation is there. You're still ill. You still have the bad news. You still face great loss. But the fear that is intensified in your mind vaporizes. Christ, who conquers the fear of death, the greatest fear, has drawn near, and He's telling you, do not be afraid. It is in the certainty that Jesus Christ is who He claims to be that you face fear in the midst of whatever life brings, and you overcome that fear by staying focused on Jesus. Same is true for all of us. So I hope this has been helpful. If it has, would you let me know with a like and a comment and a share so that others can be helped too? And if you live in the Cle Elum area and don't have a home church, I'd invite you to visit us at Calvary Chapel, 417 East Railroad Street at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. We've got a place for you here. Until then, may the Lord bless each and every one as we seek to live for and honor the Lord.